大家好，歡迎大家今日出席由氣候成績表嘅發佈會。今日我哋會有低碳想創坊聯合創辦人同埋及行政總裁莊陳有先生，同埋研究總監莊頴詩先生 Organiser 去公布我哋喺香港2020年嘅減碳表現係點嘅。好，咁事不宜遲啦，咁我哋不如首先請陳有去同我哋做個歡迎詞先啦。陳有，
我係低碳想創坊嘅聯合創辦人同埋即係而家係 CEO 莊陳有。咁好歡迎大家咧，今日晏晝花時間嚟到去聽我哋咧係發布呢個巴黎嘅監察報告。咁呢個巴黎監察行動報告咧，我哋已經係第2期。咁第1期咧就2年前發布嘅，咁已經係提醒咗香港咧要快啲採取行動。咁今日咧，我哋再一次係將呢個報告講一講俾大家聽。喺呢1-2年，香港究竟做咗啲乜嘢，去令到我哋嘅城市咧係遵循巴黎協議所定嘅目標？究竟我哋嘅表現係點？亦同時間會比較咧香港同亞洲一啲嘅主要嘅城市，究竟我哋同第啲人啦個比較係點樣樣咧？咁等一陣咧，我哋嘅lead researcher John Sayer 咧就會介紹嗰個報告嘅內容，然後之後咧我就會講翻咧我哋請咗一班嘅係非常之有知識喺呢方面有專業嘅專家咧嚟到去評價究竟香港嘅表現係點咧？我哋會俾一個成績表出嚟嘅。好。咁喺開始內容之前咧，我介紹一下低碳想創坊呢個組織，因為可能有好多朋友咧以往未必咁熟我哋嘅。低碳想創坊咧係2015年咧成立，我哋喺成立嘅時候咧就已經係帶隊咧係去到巴黎，喺現場咧見證呢個巴黎氣候協議嘅訂立嘅，非常之有歷史嘅意義啊！參與咗咧一啲嘅行動。咁就令到香港嘅聲音咧都帶到去巴黎國際嘅場合。但係我哋覺得咧係香港嘅聲音係太細，香港嘅年青人咧，相對喺其他嘅地方嘅年青人咧，冇喺呢個嘅現場出現。咁所以咧，我哋翻到嚟咧，低碳想創坊就努力咧係建立一個嘅聯繫。每一次嘅差唔多嘅呢個聯合國嘅氣候變化高峰會咧，我哋都有出席。亦同時間咧，我哋咧就係推動巴黎監察計劃。計劃分3個部分。第一個部分咧就係一個嘅行動報告，就係今日我哋要發布呢個報告啦。第2部分咧，我哋就會進行一個嘅社區對話。社區對話咧係聯合國咧係推動，希望各國進行嘅。咁香港咧，我哋亦都進行咗一次嘅社區嘅對話，將我哋嘅記錄咧擠咗喺聯合國嘅網站嗰度。呢個社區對話嘅意義咧，在於背後嘅信念係政府、商界、社群、學院嘅人士一齊可以咧係集思廣益，對抗氣候變化。我哋未來咧會推動咧喺各個環節嘅一啲嘅社區對話，包括我哋喺去年咧10月咧已經舉辦咗一次咧喺同呢個劏房工作有關嘅團體咧一齊研究一下氣候變化點樣會加劇影響咧係住喺劏房戶嘅生活，同埋我哋應該有嘅回應。咁呢個係屬於咧喺氣候變化裏邊嘅範圍咧一個嘅適應策略嘅一個範圍嚟嘅，亦都係同時間聯合國推動嘅所謂公義轉型即係當我哋轉型到一個低碳經濟嘅時候，我哋點樣能夠達至到社會公義嘅一個重點。咁未來咧，我哋會繼續喺公共衛生 喺各個地方咧係推動咧呢個嘅社區對話。咁第3個部分咧就係青年訓練。咁低碳想創坊咧係已經舉辦緊一個嘅青年訓練計劃，咁就嚟會結束啦。咁訓練我哋有20幾位嘅同學參加，佢哋都係有啲係大專嘅同學啦，有啲係畢業生。咁我哋希望咧內中有一啲嘅青年人咧，會今年咧同我哋一齊去26屆聯合國氣候變化高峰會喺格拉斯哥舉辦嘅。咁當然我哋希望咧唔會因為呢個新冠病毒咧而唔可以出席啦。好，咁我哋呢個計劃咧係會繼續推行落去嘅。但係最重要嘅咧就係得到各位嘅支持。咁低碳想創坊咧今日發布呢個嘅行動嘅報告咧，就係為咗係俾政府啦、研究機構啦、商業單位啦、民間團體啦，以及市民大眾咧，係再睇一睇我哋嘅城市究竟係同巴黎協定所定嘅目標爭幾遠？有啲咩地方我哋要繼續努力嘅？咁而家咧，我先將個時間咧交俾我哋嘅主要我哋嘅研究員阿莊施日莊先生。咁佢會用英文去介紹呢個報告嘅。呢個報告咧，而家暫時都係用英文寫，咁我哋會翻譯成為中文嘅。但係因為我哋氣候變化好急啊，我哋唔想等翻譯完先至發布啦，我哋先發布咗個呢個英文版先咁樣嚇。咁好，John， I would like to invite John Sayer, our lead researcher, to present the Paris Watch Action Report.
There's been a year waiting to put out this report, the Climate Action Report. We did one and we published it at the end of 2018 before the COP meeting in Poland. And then we put out a research report, and Chanya will talk more about, the report card, ranking Hong Kong and marking Hong Kong's performance. But we've been waiting. In a way, it's been a year of waiting and deciding what's the best point to put out this report. We normally put it out before the climate talks, but they were postponed for a year. But we wanted to continue to put out regular climate reports to monitor Hong Kong's climate action. So we wondered if we should postpone, but then in the last quarter of last year, a few things happened. In September, China announced a carbon neutrality target by 2050. The Council for Sustainable Development of Hong Kong finally issued its recommendations on long-term decarbonization. And then a few days later in the policy address, our chief executive actually stated that we would aim for carbon neutrality by before 2050. So those were significant enough events that we thought it was important to put out this report, and we will do another one next year, of course, or maybe the end of this year. For Paris Watch, what we try and do is focus on what's actually happened, not what's promised in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, but what's actually been done in terms of climate action. And we look for the results and for the impact. So the purpose really is to just encourage higher levels of ambition. That's what the Paris Agreement is all about, is trying to ramp up ambition by everyone who's subject to that. And to do this, we track Hong Kong's performance, and we try and compare this where we can with neighboring cities and look at what's happening in the region as well. This is the Paris Climate Agreement. It's a relatively simple agreement for UN documents available in all 5 UN languages, including Chinese and English, the official languages. And when China ratified this, it deposited a letter with the UN, which essentially says that for the purposes of this agreement, we are now ratifying this. I think it took them till towards the end of 2016, because it has to go through a process in each country. And what they essentially said is this agreement also applies to Hong Kong and Macau. So this Paris Climate Agreement applies to us. So what we did and what we've been doing with Paris Watch is to try and break the agreement down into 5 elements that are easier to track and easier for us all to understand. And so that's what we've done. And I'll run quickly through them during this report of what we found this year. But it's basically, question 1 is on emissions. Are the emissions sufficient to achieve the UN targets of well below 2 degrees and close to 1.5? The second is on renewable energy and the question of, which is a key to reducing emissions. How are we doing in terms of renewable energy? The third is using energy more efficiently. So using less energy anyway, which makes the renewable energy demand easier. The fourth question is about adapting to make sure that to climate change impact, to make sure the city is healthy and safe. And finally, the systems that would help with these mitigation and adaptation. Do we have the right governance, finance, and so on to achieve the mitigation targets? So those are the 5 questions that we think fairly comprehensively cover the letter and the spirit of the Paris Climate Agreement. So the first, I'll return to Council for Sustainable Development, and they put out their report in November last year, a couple of months ago. And they finally recommended to the government that we should look to set a net zero emissions target by 2050. And they made 55 recommendations as part of their report. And while the recommendations cover all the right bases, they mainly call for the government to look at what action plan and what targets they will set, which is slightly disappointing. This started in June 2019, this public engagement. So it took 1.5 years to come up with recommendations. But in their introduction, they said, and I'll quote, "Time is running out for combating climate change." They said the costs of inaction are terrifying. And they said in their June 2019 introduction to the public engagement, and they were quoting a report from 2018, scientists have warned that we have some 10 years left to limit climate change catastrophe. So they were basically saying in their report, their starting report, that from 2018 we have 10 years. Well, they didn't come out with their report till November 2020. So that's 1.5 years gone. From 2018, it's even more. So you can say 7 years. Also, the 55 recommendations that they produced, frankly, if you look at these areas of recommendations and issues that need to be Hong Kong put out a climate change report in 2015, that's 6 years ago now, or 5 years. And they looked at the same areas. We know it's about energy, we know it's about buildings, we know it's about transport, and we know it's about waste. And if we can have action in these areas, then we can begin to take climate change action. So my point really is that we've been looking at these issues. They've been recognized for 5.5, 6 years. And we've now spent 1.5 years getting to this point. And in fact, with the Sustainable Development Council, the convener, Lam Chiu Ying, he actually resigned before the report came out. You probably remember from newspaper and media reports. He mentioned 2 reasons: the slowness of progress in putting out the report and the lack of transparency over the debate about domestic and imported renewable energy and how that's going to work. So he got frustrated and he was the convener. Anyway, a few days after that report came out, the chief executive issued her policy address, and she said, "I now announce that Hong Kong SAR will strive to achieve carbon neutrality before 2050. To this end, the government will update the plan next year." And this is obviously a very important statement of intent. It's what Hong Kong must do. But unfortunately, again, we have some concerns. This was on page 62 of the policy address. It was the 5th sentence in paragraph 126 of the policy address. And it followed, before that came all kinds of announcements earlier in the policy address, much closer to the front, about a third runway, about new bridges, about new car parks, sections on innovation, technology, smart cities, education. None of them mentioned a low carbon pathway. None of them mentioned green or sustainable technologies and how these plans will be integrated with this profound goal of achieving carbon neutrality before 2050. Much of the policy address was about housing, construction, urban revitalization. But again, there was no mention of the concept of green buildings and low carbon development at all. So that's of some concern. While we welcome this statement, it seemed to be divorced or an orphaned statement from the rest of the policy address. A good deal of her plan talked about cooperation within the Greater Bay Area and the importance of this in terms of finance and technology as well. But many studies show that that area, the Pearl River Delta, the Greater Bay Area, is one of the world's most at-risk areas in terms of sea level rise and flooding and the combination of high tide, sea level rise and more intense typhoons. And that's incredibly important in terms of planning for adaptation and climate change. And yet that again was not mentioned in the policy address at all. It was just all about how important the Greater Bay Area will be economically. So in the next 6 months or 5 months now, Carrie Lam said in the middle of next year, we expect a rewrite or an update of the Climate Action Plan 2030 plus, and I presume it will become 2050 plus. And I guess we'll also see a revision of our greenhouse gas reduction targets, and that will be very important, and we'll have to see what is contained. And that's the crux of the matter, really, in terms of this year's report. This target is important, but we need to see what will actually happen. And we'll be monitoring that as part of Paris Watch to see what Hong Kong is actually planning. When we look at the targets that we have in the current plans, they come down to between 3.3 and 3.8, so average 3.55 tons for each of us in Hong Kong by 2030. That has to be revised. We've run the sites. There are groups that are such as the World Resources Institute and WWF and the Carbon Disclosure Project, who developed a methodology for city-level science-based targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement that bring us down to carbon neutrality by 2050. And if you run these figures for Hong Kong, we should be just over 2 tons per capita by 2030, not 3.5. So we very much hope that the Hong Kong government will revise the 10-year target in 2030 to a much lower level of emissions for all of us in Hong Kong. Okay, on renewable energy, subject of great debate, we looked at some figures. Again, this year we were looking at what are the actual current generating capacity, what we can find for the whole of Japan. And it's difficult with cities because there is a question of what's generated within or outside. Are we talking about capacity? We're talking about consumption. But it looks like 18.5% of Japan's energy is now renewable. Seoul isn't too good at 1.8. Singapore's getting better with more photovoltaic cells on things like the public housing. But Hong Kong, from what we can see, is below 1% when we look at figures from the Hong Kong government. This is obviously, we've got a huge long way to go. And again, the target of 3 to 4% by 2030 has to be revised upwards if we stand any chance of achieving the chief executive's goal of carbon neutrality before 2050. In terms of energy efficiency within the city, we look at 2 areas. We look at buildings and transport, because together these are the great majority. Over 80% of our energy usage comes in these sections. And again, we've seen almost no new initiatives in the interim period on buildings. And it's not as if these issues are unknown. So I think waiting for the result of yet another public consultation, rather than getting on with the essential task of improving regulation and incentives for improving building efficiency in Hong Kong, we have lost some time during this year because we've seen no increase in that. To compare cities is not always easy. because the cities we're looking at, some of them, like Singapore, requires air conditioning all year round. Tokyo requires heating, and as does Seoul in the winter. And some of the cities, the Pearl River Delta, require just air conditioning principally in the summer. So the energy demand is different in different cities. Nonetheless, we've been looking a little bit at energy efficiency in the report. When we move on to transport, again, there has been a tiny bit of movement in the budget in February this year. What we saw was a few initiatives on more electric vehicle charging points, some plans to phase out the most polluting vehicles, pilot schemes on electric ferries and public light buses. But really, this doesn't amount to a comprehensive transport plan. And what we need, if we are to honor the pledge to and strive for carbon neutrality by 2050, is a comprehensive transport plan that looks at a low energy pathway, not a little bit on cars here and a little bit on ferries there, and not pilots and not research, but actual action plans with targets. We need that kind of comprehensive plan, I believe. So what was announced in the budget in February doesn't add up to that. And I very much hope, and I think we all do, that in the response to the recommendations by the Council for Sustainable Development, our new plan will have some concrete overall coherent transport plan for Hong Kong for carbon neutral transport going forward. If we look at adaptation, this is important, not always covered. At the beginning of the week, on Monday, there was an Adaptation Summit, and many world leaders spoke there. And the Secretary General of the UN said adaptation cannot be the neglected half of the climate equation. It's important in the Paris Agreement. It's important for all of us in terms of a safe and secure future as we get more weather extremes. So what we did in the Climate Action Report this time, we tried to look at the key issues that would affect Hong Kong in terms of the risks. And we tried to look at all the policies that we could find and mark green where we felt there was an adequate policy and policy coverage, orange where there was some coverage, but we felt there were gaps, and red where we really felt the policies were quite poor or it was inadequate in terms of coverage. We tried to identify for all cities, but we couldn't make fair judgments in every case for every city. So therefore, we will continue to develop these tables, but we felt where we couldn't make a fair judgment, we left those cells blank. So I'll run very quickly through the types of climate hazard, and you can see. So heat waves and heat-induced illnesses. And then we look at the key, in this case, the key 7 actions that are most important. So what you need to, and what the good policy would involve, heat mapping and thermal imaging, cooling centers around the city, community engagement and education on what to do in a heat wave, strategy, how to protect the most vulnerable groups, the very old, the very young, pregnant women, outdoor workers, green spaces, and correlation of illness and hot weather periods, so that we've got statistics on how many extra people are ill or made ill during heat waves. And then policies and practices in urban design to avoid heat island effect. So this is an example of one, and we've got about 7, I think. The other is heat and precipitation related to vector-borne disease. We did it for that. Of course, Hong Kong government talks about increased incidence of dengue fever, for example. That's a result of the heating planet. Then we looked at water shortages and drought, and we looked at, again, community education, water risk analysis, and diversification of supply. These are from what we found from the documentation around the world, the key policy issues. We looked at increased fire risk. Obviously, we've seen fires in Australia, we've seen fires in California and other places around the world that are attributed to climate change. We have small fires, but what if we had a major joined up fire? Are we ready for that? We looked at sea level rise and sea flooding and coastal erosion and how we protect our coasts. We looked at typhoons and flooding and landslips. So this is water, rain and wind, which combined with sea level rise, of course, can have additional impact, multiple impact. We looked at reduced biodiversity and damage to ecosystems. We know this is important. It's important for us physically, we know that when you mess around with ecosystems, there is a danger of new diseases, but I think psychologically as well. And in terms of responsibility for biodiversity and ensuring that species don't go extinct. So that's what we did in terms of adaptation. And we've done a traffic light, red, amber, and green on each of those to see what policies we believe are in place in Hong Kong and in Singapore, Tokyo, and Seoul, Shenzhen and Guangzhou, in where we can get the information. And then behind all of this adaptation and mitigation is the question of do we have the right systems governance systems and finance and technical and training systems to achieve these goals. And we looked at what these systems might look like. And again, we looked at the headlines from the reports we saw. And we can see for effective climate governance, you need political leadership. And then you can look down high-level leadership, clear decision-making, interdepartmental coordination, continuity in policy, financial and human resources, and so on. So we put these, and then we looked at Hong Kong, we looked at Singapore. And in terms of political leadership, Hong Kong didn't come out too well. We have the Steering Committee on Climate Change, from what we can find, has not been a meeting since 2016 of this body. This is meant to be the top body. And to do the consultation, they passed it on to the Sustainable Development Council. They passed it on to Hong Kong University. It kind of went down the line in terms of devolved action. And this is meant to be a top-level group, but even if it was, you can compare Hong Kong and Singapore. Here's the steering committee, secretaries for transport, housing, environment, development. Look at Singapore. Their interministerial committee on climate change includes foreign affairs, finance, trade and industry, and national development. It has a body, the National Climate Change Secretariat, reporting to the Prime Minister that services this body. It just seems that has greater priority in Singapore. The governance structure is more dynamic, more high level, and more functional, frankly speaking, than what we've seen in Hong Kong. So we very much hope that when the plan comes through mid-year, in terms of new climate action in Hong Kong, that the governance will be, and the political leadership will be one important element. Policies and plans and transparency and monitoring evaluation, we also saw as important in terms of governance. Again, we compared Hong Kong and Singapore. I will say in terms of policies and plans, there's quite a lot of evenness between the two cities. In terms of transparency and monitoring evaluation, it's pretty even between Hong Kong and Singapore. When we looked at climate finance, again, it's the two cities are obviously they're both financial centers, and they both see the importance of developing green finance. So we see quite similar developments in both cities. And we've looked at, again, key indicators of this. And the last thing we did was to look at memberships of international city-level climate action organizations, reporting initiatives like C40 cities, like the Global Covenant of Mayors and local governments, and the Just Recovery, which is a post-COVID Grow Back Green initiative, and reporting to CDP. And Hong Kong, in that sense, does quite well in terms of its international links with these different city initiatives on climate. We added a few more underneath, like Jakarta and KL and Beijing and Bangkok to compare, but Hong Kong really scores quite well if it can translate those memberships and those exchanges of best practice into action. The finance sector itself and the regulatory bodies, they haven't stood still during 2020 in terms of climate action. We had this announcement in May of the cross-agency steering group, which takes in the Monetary Authority and the Environment Bureau, the MPF people, the insurance, the stock exchange, and the Securities and Futures Commission, to cooperate on building green finance, both reducing risks from climate and accelerating positive investment in green initiatives. And we've seen action from various regulatory bodies and parts of the finance sector. The stock exchange in Hong Kong has put out this platform so that investors can see suitable green projects and green activities and green business to invest in. And the Monetary Authority and the Securities and Futures Commission both moved later in the year to to develop green and sustainable banking and to look at reporting of climate risk, I think, as well. So there's been quite a lot of action within the finance sector during the year on adjusting to looking at the risks and the opportunities from the path to a low carbon future. The other thing we looked at is the market mechanisms that can govern climate action. That is carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. And again, Hong Kong doesn't look very good when you look at the picture here. Seoul has emissions trading scheme for 5 years now, and it's got plans for a carbon tax. Tokyo has emissions trading system from 10 years old. Guangzhou and Shenzhen are both part of the sort of pilot testing of the ETS system within China. And Singapore has a carbon tax, at least at this stage, on high emitters, which they hope to roll out. Hong Kong at the moment is not part of any such schemes. We have no emissions trading system, we have no carbon tax. And again, we think this is an issue that will hopefully be addressed in our new climate strategy. So to conclude, we say we need to go from aspiration to action in the plan, and that's what we very much believe and hope for in the middle of this year. And Greta Thunberg, in her inimitable style, said about all the targets that are being set around the world by Japan, Seoul, China, Europe, UK, and now the United States, hopefully in the next few weeks. Distant hypothetical targets are being set and big speeches are being given. We need to stop focusing on goals and targets for 2030 or 2050. We need to implement annual binding carbon budgets today. So she's saying, okay, it's all very well making plans for your successor or your successor's successor and setting those targets, but the plans need to start now. And that's very much a conclusion for our own climate action plan report this year. The effect, what we need and what we lack and what we must do as soon as possible if we're to believe the government statements that climate change is urgent and we have very few years to achieve this. We need immediate targets. We need targets to start. We need annual 5-year, 10-year targets, not just 30 years out. And these need to be guided by milestones and KPIs. We need to know what those targets and how we're measuring them. We need costings on all climate action and a financing strategy. We need the climate plan, unlike the policy address, to be integrated with health, finance plans, social and development policies, urban renewal policies, transport policies. It must be integrated if it's to be meaningful. We need an engagement plan within the climate action plan, how to draw in business and finance from our finance sector and the public and all of us as individuals in terms of working together on a climate action plan to achieve that goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. And then above all else, as I think I've said earlier, we need leadership. We need leadership, leadership, leadership to drive this at the highest possible level. We can't put this plan on page 62 of reports. If this is to be serious and we are to go for carbon neutrality, there are immense economic opportunities in doing this, but it's got to be led and driven by the government. And that's it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, John. 唔該晒 John。而家我亦都想邀請埋陳友啦，都按嗰個 screen 嘅。咁咧我會去讀一啲喺 chat room 嘅問題。咁如果你有任何問題嘅話咧，咁又或者疑問咧，你都可以就住呢個 climate action report 咧喺 chat room 度打出嚟嘅。咁我會朗讀出嚟，咁就等阿 John 同陳友會答啦。Like please type in the questions regarding the presentation from John on the climate action report. I will speak out the questions and then John and Chen Yao will respond. 咁已經有一條題目啦。So Zoe from SCMP asked, does CCIL have any suggestions for how the government can take into account a green recovery, particularly after COVID? Does CCIL see any likelihood Hong Kong can move towards that direction?
I have a slide. Not that I predicted this question, but I did predict this question. It's important. It is a huge opportunity for us to respond. As we are a steering committee member of C40 cities as Hong Kong, our Secretary of the Environment, K.S. Wong, actually signed up to the C40 cities mayor's agenda for a green and just recovery. He did more than that. He put Hong Kong on the task force to achieve it globally. 43 megacities signed up, but 11 cities said we'll be on the task force. And what does this mean? It means that the C40 mayors joining business, civil society, and climate activists and everyone agree the only stimulus should be a green stimulus, committing to an equitable and inclusive recovery, meaning nobody left behind, protecting and championing mass transit, prioritizing clean energy, investing in resilient cities, and ending all fossil fuel investments and subsidies. So Hong Kong signed up to this in May, I believe, saying that, accepting that a green recovery was really important. And I really hope that this is made real. What it means, I think, is if we have large-scale bailouts for business, they should be conditional on a green pathway for those businesses. And therefore, the government can work towards a decarbonization plan in combination with recovering from the pandemic. On things like solving the problem, we've all seen the problem of the subdivided flats and caged dwellings in Hong Kong, a real social issue. That needs sorting out. And we've seen the impact when we have disease like the pandemic. So that needs sorting out, but that can be done in a healthy way. Certainly a green, energy efficient approach to urban renewal will also be a healthier approach. So rather than a trade-off between environmental, social issues and economic recovery, they can really bring co-benefits if we look at the social issues of economic recovery along with a green, a Build Back Greener plan.
Yeah, I'll give a supplement. I'll give a pessimistic assessment on whether this would be realized. Okay, so I'll speak in Cantonese, and John knows our position. 咁低碳想創坊咧唔係一個政策性嘅機構本身，不過我哋咧喺環保呢個範圍、氣候變化呢個範圍，我哋咧係對一個 green recovery 咧係比較悲觀嘅喺香港嚇。因為正如阿 John 所引述喺特首嘅施政報告裏邊咧，講到呢個2050年嘅目標咧，只係寫咗個目標啫，而呢個目標咧係等咗1年零8個月咁樣諮詢去到呢度先講出嚟。而同時間咧，正如阿 John 講，如果我哋真係要達至到 green recovery 綠色復甦咧，我哋咧要每一個經濟刺激嘅措施咧都有綠嘅元素嚇，即係呢個係第一個 C40嘅6大綠色復甦原則嘅第一個。而我哋聽到政府而家諗緊嘅都仲係大嶼山即係填島工程，仲係三跑嚇。我哋擔心好大嘅壓力咧，喺呢個疫情過咗去之後咧，會係鼓勵呢個報復式嘅消費嚇。我哋聽唔到即係譬如綠色交通有個大嘅計劃。咁未來咧特首講咗咧話，佢喺半年內咧會出一個計劃。咁不如我哋俾個機會睇下呢半年裏邊係咪真係有個計劃出嚟，係見到呢個綠色復甦係個主調嚇。綠色復甦已經喺歐洲周圍你哋都聽到啦。就算喺美國咁困難嘅失業率咁高嘅時候咧，都仲係着重咧製造綠色嘅就業機會，係啊，新嘅政府上場之後，咁好啦，咁香港絕對係有機會可以做得到嘅。咁亦都係我哋亦都呢幾個月嚟咧係做咗一個賽馬會支持嘅一個嘅綠色復甦嘅社區對話計劃。我哋聽到好多人咧都希望我哋嘅復甦咧係綠色嘅，係啦。咁呢個咧係有個社會期望喺裏邊，係啦。咁政府做唔做得到咧？待後觀察，睇實際嘅行動。
This will be a presentation from Mr. Chong on the Hong Kong Climate Report Card。陳友，我 pass 個 floor 俾你去講下個成績表啊。
我哋邀咗香港院校同埋咧喺環保上邊咧係有好長時間參與嘅意見領袖嚟到一齊評價一下我哋對於巴黎協定所提出嘅目標，香港嘅表現係去到邊度咧？咁我哋分咗15個嘅範疇俾佢哋俾分，咁就包括係mitigation 嘅減碳、減免adaptation 適應，以至係 governance 即係管治3個範圍。咁我就唔逐個講啦。整體嚟講咧，我哋嘅評判冇我份㗎，冇我份，我代大家講嘅但係我同意嘅。咁咧就係第一咧就係整體咧，我哋認為香港係 C。上一期我哋俾呢個分咧就係 C 減即係有啲咁多進步嘅。咁主要咧都仍然係因為政府咧終於定咗2050年呢個碳中和呢個計劃。我哋認為香港咧係責無旁貸，應該係出咗呢個嘅目標之外，就係達標嘅一個計劃。咁呢個計劃咧未出，所以咧可能就說服唔到啲俾分嘅人士咧，係應該俾高啲分啦，就 C 好啦。咁我哋睇一啲嘅項目咧，不如關於碳排放咧係 C 減，其實個問題就好似正話咁講啦，咁我唔重複啦。喺綠色能源嗰方面咧，再生能源嗰方面咧，D 加，咁點解低咧？咁因為其實呢2年咧推展咗上網電價計劃。咁呢個計劃係好嘅，係民間團體要求咗一段時間，咁然後咧係做咗出嚟。咁而家咧都應該有1萬個計劃，根據政府嘅數字1萬個申請。咁但係其實咧嘅呢個上網電價計劃咧，暫時只可以咧達至到唔夠可能唔夠0.5% 嘅總嘅電發展，但係不過可再生能源其實嘅本地發展潛力咧，係政府咧係忽視咗嘅。即係喺過去呢幾年咧，譬如話風電啦，譬如呢個嘅浮動嘅太陽能站喺水塘嘅面嘅發展啦，甚至有啲嘅大學嘅研究認為，如果係我哋盡用呢個屋頂嘅面積啦，咁其實可以推高嗰個太陽再生能源佔嘅百分比咧，可能去到10%都唔定。係啊，如果係哈佛嘅一個研究，甚至認為風力發電可以去到30%添咁樣。好啦，咁我哋唔糾纏喺個數字準定唔準啦，但係我哋係見唔到呢個政府大力投資呢個嘅再生能源。咁希望日後會改變我哋呢個 assessment 啦，咁樣。咁關於呢個建築物嘅效率作為綠色建築，係我哋有綠色建築，但係你見唔到咧係大力嘅係推動，咁所以亦都係 C 加。咁呢個低碳低碳即係綠色嘅運輸，咁你見到又係即係好慢咁就 C 減。咁關於呢個嘅垃圾管理徵費嘅制度，竟然間都推行唔到，咁非常之令人失望啦。咁所以亦都係 C 減啦。咁係adaptation 嗰方面咧，我哋要推動一個安全嘅將來環境。咁喺健康嗰方面D 加啦，大家睇到呢個當呢個新冠病毒侵入嘅時候咧，我哋係手忙腳亂咁樣即係喺政策上面。好咁我諗社區嘅回應咧，隨住呢個嘅氣候變化嘅增加咧，公共衛生個挑戰咧會越嚟越大。咁我哋我跳一跳去睇一睇嗰個管治嗰邊啦。咁我哋認為即係管治本身，即係推動氣候變化、回應氣候變化、回應氣候災難嘅管治咧，我哋話 D 加，因為我哋需要見到一個 有效跨部門整體呢個規劃嘅一個嘅係計劃嘅團體，唔係淨係一個部門嚇環境局就去做晒咁多樣嘢。我哋喺國際其他嘅地方咧，好着重呢個嘅整體嘅統籌發展係啦。喺呢個嘅綠色金融嗰方面咧，其實香港亦都做咗一啲嘅動作，包括即係喺3月嘅成立咗一個嘅task group 咁，但係我哋仍然都係比希望咧係嗰個進度會更加快同埋發展，咁未來咧可能會有啲改變嘅係啦。咁 technology 當然我哋有好多嘅創新基金近來咧係多咗，咁但係咧係咪推動到綠色轉型啊？應用喺應對氣候變化嘅減碳上邊咧，仲係要等待去見到一個實際嘅行動嘅，所以呢個咧專家仲係俾 C 減嘅。咁 monitoring 即係話監察嗰個表現啊，將我哋嘅資料發放啊、公開啊等等咧，咁我哋係俾 C 嘅。好啦，咁整體嘅報告咧，仍然都係香港係好謹慎、好保守、好小心、好慢。我哋嘅氣候變化、氣候嘅災難咧係急速咁樣去上升。喺大家見到呢個嘅旱災、火災、颱風越嚟越大嘅颱風、酷熱，2020年係歷來最熱嘅一年。2019年亦都係最熱嘅一年，2018又係最熱嘅一年，即係過去10年裏邊咧有6-7年咧都係全世界最熱嘅一年。咁我哋仲可以點樣等咧？我哋仲點可以用咁慢嘅速度嚟到去悠閒咁樣回應緊一個其實係威脅全世界人類，亦都威脅我哋呢個城市發展嘅一個嘅災難嚇。綠色嘅復甦、綠色嘅投資、綠色嘅工作嘅機會、綠色嘅新生活，其實咧就係一個未來經濟發展嘅主軸，而香港咧喺呢方面咧需要行前啲、行快啲。
如果大家對陳友頭先嗰個成績表有任何疑問咧，都可以喺 chat room 嗰度打出嚟嘅。咁另外咧，我哋亦都會喺個 chat room 度 share 翻呢兩個 report 嘅 download link， 你哋亦都可以喺低碳想創坊嘅網頁入邊揾到呢兩個報告書嘅。
A question from Oriental Press that whether Hong Kong is performing the worst among major cities, and also whether we believe that the 2050 carbon neutrality target will not be achieved by what is being done now. So you want to respond?
As I said at the beginning, it's actually, we're in a kind of waiting state now. We need to see what Tokyo is doing. We need to see what Korea, how they will make their plans real. And we need to see, of course, China's plan, which is also promised as part of its 5-year planning process, coming out later this year. So we're in a balance, but I will say one thing. I mean, Shanghai announced about a week ago that it will try to peak carbon emissions in 2025. That's 5 years ahead of the national target. And I think it's the responsibility of all the wealthier cities in China and on the east coast of China is to try and exceed the national targets, to allow the less developed parts of China in the West to peak and then to reduce their carbon emissions slightly more slowly than those who can already have good health, education provision and infrastructure, a lot of financial capacity and muscle. And that will be important. And Hong Kong, of course, falls into that category. Will it be achieved? Is it achievable by 2050? As I said, this is a promise that leaders are making now for their successor. But the beauty of the Paris Agreement is that it has a kind of ratchet up mechanism. Every 5 years, there's a comparison of how everyone is doing around the world. And then each country is asked to improve its ambition level. So there is plenty of opportunity every 5 years for every country to increase its ambition and improve its plans. So if countries are falling behind, or territories like Hong Kong, they can 5 years later put in a more ambitious plan, and there will be a lot of peer pressure on the laggards. So I think, you know, there is a mechanism for this. And of course, events are on our side as we see more impacts of climate change. Hopefully that will focus the attention of both populations in general and governments to take more serious climate action and to, you know, to be more aggressive and ambitious in their targets. So there's a degree of optimism that I feel on that. I mean, that fits a little bit with the questions from Candice at RTHK. How much are we falling short? I showed you that science-based target. By 2030, we should be on about 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent for each one of us per capita. And we're at the moment, the current government plan is between 3.3 and 3.8. So that needs improving when we put in our long-term plan in the middle of the year. Until that's done, we're not on track. And of course, the speed we go down is better for the whole world, because then we use up less of the global carbon budget on the way to 2050. If the curve bulges out too much and we carry on, peak later, and then go down dramatically, we've emitted more carbon than if we have a concave curve on the graph and begin to go down now and get pretty low by 2040 and flatten the curve out. That would be much more desirable, especially for the world's more affluent and more developed cities.
John 簡單講就係OK 係好多城市都 announce 宣佈咗個目標，但係冇 plan 咧，好難比較。即係我哋都唔會講香港一定係最差。喺某啲範圍上邊咧，如果你睇個報告裏邊咧有啲比較咧，我哋係譬如再生能源嘅使用，我哋係差啲嘅。係啦，咁有啲其他嘅獨立嘅一啲嘅措施咧，我哋係香港係差嘅，譬如好似啲廢物管理啊等等。好啦，咁但係咧你話我哋對於香港可唔可以做得到咧？2050年咧，最重要喺未來呢半年裏邊，政府係咪真係落實出到一個計劃？咁我哋可能下一份巴黎嘅行動報告咧，就會係討論呢件，咁所以咧而家唔可以預計啦。阿莊都提及嘅咧就係上海既然已經好快咁出咗一個回應國家嘅目標嘅一個嘅報告會提早5年咧係碳排放係到頂。咁呢個咧就我哋香港係作為一個即係進步富裕嘅社會咧，係有責任做多過其他嘅地方，就唔係應該跟人嘅。咁所以我哋幾時都用呢種態度咧，要求香港係高過要求第二啲地方嘅，係啦。咁所以自然間因為我哋要求高啲咧，我哋就對於未做嘅嘢咧，我哋係會睇得重啲嘅，係啦。好，咁有冇第二啲問題咧？
唔該，陳友 ，thank you， 陳友。There's 2 questions brought forward from the climate action report presentation by John. I would like to get them answered here. The first one is asked by Simon Wang. He asks, when we measure carbon footprint in Hong Kong, do we include the energy consumed in manufacturing the goods imported to our city? Presumably, this is a significant amount of carbon footprint as well. In terms of methodology, how do we account for such indirect carbon footprint?
Yeah, that's an important question. You know, we use, and the United Nations and the Paris Agreement use production-based or regional-based or area-based, meaning only what is produced, the emissions from activity within a territory or a country usually, not the embodied carbon that's imported. And this is quite important for Hong Kong, which of course has a very small manufacturing and a very small agricultural sector. In other words, we import what we eat, we import our clothes, our electronics and consumer items from outside. But the UN system is that, and in a way that lets us off the hook a little bit, that you only report what is the carbon that's used within your territory. However, the government and the Council for Sustainable Development has recognized this and the difference between production-based and consumption-based. They mention it, and the recommendation from the DC is that we at the very least account for the consumption base so that we produce statistics to show how we're doing on carbon emissions from all that we use, not just all that we produce. There was a study at Hong Kong U a few years ago that just looked at meat and dairy. And if you just take that into account, just those two consumer items more than doubled our individual carbon footprints in Hong Kong. So you can see Singapore has a considerably higher per capita carbon footprint than Hong Kong, but they have a petrochemical sector and an oil refining sector. So all the energy used in producing the fuels is charged to Singapore. Hong Kong can then buy that fuel and it doesn't count as any emissions at all. So it's a very good question. So two things can happen that can help us through this. One is that we do produce figures on consumption-based emissions as well to see how well we're doing. And the second is that on product, we as individuals can't know that unless product labeling begins to look at the embodied carbon. So we begin to look at making choices when we're consuming on low carbon and high carbon products. And there are some companies like Logitech and Unilever who are beginning to put the carbon footprint and the embodied carbon of their products on the labeling. And I very much hope that there's no point in the government telling us to behave well if we don't have the information to behave well. So I think these two things will help us in that area.
好，係，我冇補充啦。
We also have another question from Candace from RTHK. Actually, she has 3 questions. Maybe I ask one by one, then John and Chong, you can answer. The first one is, how much is Hong Kong falling short now from becoming carbon neutral by 2050 as the CE hopes and the goal of Paris Agreement?
Yeah, I answered that in combination with the previous question, talking about the 2030 targets. So there's nothing much more to say. We need to improve our 2030 targets. We need to bend the curve concave on our way to carbon neutrality by 2050.
Okay. Well, John, because this is from RTHK, I suppose they want a recording. So if I may, I would just say what Hong Kong needs is now a plan, a roadmap, a budget, and a will to follow through to 2050 target to achieving that. The important point that we make is it is not just making a target. It's more important even to have an annual binding plan that cover the whole development of the city. So if you ask us whether we are falling short at this point, I would say at this point, yes, but the government has every opportunity and space to change that judgment, especially in what is going, in what they are going to do in the next 6 months to come up with a concrete action plan.
Thank you. Then the second question is from Candace RTHK again. Any particular proposal you hope to see when the government announce the new climate action plan by the government later this year? How aggressive the policy should be?
Yeah, it should be excitingly aggressive, obviously. It needs to be to reach that target. We're not on track and we need to. But the policy areas are clear. Renewable energy, the critical question, how much of that can we produce locally and how much do we have to import from the region? If you don't answer that question, or nothing else follows sensibly. That's the fundamental underlying question of decarbonization for Hong Kong. Following on from that question of renewable energy, of course, is the efficiency of the use of energy in terms of buildings and transport above all else. And for those two, as I said earlier, we need comprehensive and integrated plans, not individual pilots, studies, isolated incentives and subsidies that don't all join up properly.
I think a governance structure that takes responsibilities of implementing an annual plan that the government develops, including even giving up on some polluting or carbon emitting intensive infrastructure projects, such as the land cow development.
Thank you, Chen Yao. The last question is from Candice from RTHK. For the past year, has the city fallen short compared to other cities on green policy or combating climate change?
We've fallen short in terms of missed opportunities to continue the areas we know perfectly well we have to improve on: buildings, transport, and waste. We fell short on waste because the social dimensions and ensuring a just transition when prices increase for things like waste disposal were not properly taken into account. So it was opposed, and the government needs to look at the social impact of climate action. But in those other areas, it's just that we've been waiting for this long-term decarbonisation public engagement for a year and a half and doing nothing while we wait. And I think we've certainly fallen short in terms of our own ambition level. C40 Cities produced a report in 2016 called Deadline 2020, saying the next 4 years, meaning from 2016, are absolutely critical if cities are to play their part in achieving the Paris climate agreement. And it seems like we've done very little and made little progress in those 4 years. But when you compare it to other cities in the region, like I say, all the long-term decarbonisation targets have been announced towards the end of last year, and we're now waiting for plans from everywhere. So we're kind of in a waiting game, and then we can make honest comparisons of how realistic and how ambitious each country's plan is.
Thank you, John. And I think I will take the last final questions from Edmund Lau, The Green Earth. We would like to see environmental impact information disclosure by the big companies. What drives the companies to disclose embodied carbon of a products? How to push more companies to voluntarily disclose this information together?
Yeah, my experience with business, the voluntary nature of taking climate initiatives can be twofold. One is to position the company in the market, and the second is because of pressure from investors and lenders to perform better, so banks and investors. But I'm a believer that these voluntary initiatives have to be backed up by regulations, and government regulations can include incentives, carrots and sticks, subsidies and penalties. So you need a combination of industry-led initiatives and government regulation. And on a thing like embodied carbon, yeah, I mean, we have food labeling to tell us how much cholesterol is in the food. Can we have labeling to tell us how much carbon is in the food as well? And I believe consumers will begin to then make some choices. But the government has to mandate that this labeling is there. And I think investors will be very interested in any business that's not taking climate risk seriously, because there's a huge risk there of stranded assets or poor performance or losing public confidence. So there's some of the pressure is coming from the finance sector for companies to properly report climate risk and climate exposure. So the combination of voluntary, business-led, market-led, and regulation, I think, has to drive better corporate behavior on climate.
Right. I'll give a supplement in Cantonese. 我補充少少阿俊所講，即係話公司會唔會自動去 disclose 咧？咁係嘅，公司咧好少會自動嘅，係啦，即係你唔可以冇壓力俾嘅公司㗎，要有regulation 啦，消費者選擇啦，同埋投資者嘅選擇嘅。咁特別係喺而家即係金融界裏邊已經開始講，即係投資咧喺呢個嘅可持續發展，呢個氣候風險，咁咧都成為咗投資者要考慮嘅一啲因素啦。咁最近喺美國啱啱上任嘅耶倫啦，好出名啦。咁佢喺上任嘅時候咧，已經喺國會講咗咧。即係佢哋會睇 呢個銀行嘅加強銀行嗰個對氣候變化風險嘅要求嚇，同埋嗰個嘅disclosure 嚇，即係資料公開。咁呢個係國際已經係越嚟越成為一種嘅規範。咁咧啲嘢咧係要有規範先得嘅，所以聯交所對於即係上市公司關於 ESG 嘅報告嘅要求係有效嘅嚇。如果你叫佢 voluntary 咧，好少人做嘅。咁但係好多第二啲公司噶嘛，即係唔係淨係上市公司噶嘛，好多第二啲公司噶嘛。咁係咪要喺產品嘅標籤啊，喺其他嘅地方嗰度咧？咁呢個係要政府去做嘅。低碳想創坊咧，順便賣一賣廣告嚇，有一個咧叫做低碳嘅標籤。咁我哋每年都係去說服啲公司參加㗎，都講到口水乾㗎。咁咧就我哋希望咧，隨住咧呢個氣候變化已經係成為咗呢個嘅大家接受嘅現實危機回應啦。咁公司會 care 包括佢嘅品牌，然後咧就會係更多人咧係採納呢啲嘅標籤嚇咁樣。咁喺呢度咧，如果大家有興趣嘅話咧，可以聯絡我哋嚇，之後咁我哋再討論一下點樣用標籤嚟到去推動呢個嘅氣候變化嗰個嘅 compliance 嗰個責任嚇咁樣。
OK， 唔該陳友 ，Thank you John，Thank you Chong for holding the Q&A sections。
我哋咧係對香港咧係有期望，亦都有信心啦嚇。雖然我哋而家對香港嘅表現咧嘅我哋嘅判斷咧係較為令人失望，係較為負面。咁只不過都係因為我哋有深刻啲嘅有更深嘅期望，係佢好啲嚇，就係恨鐵不成鋼。咁我哋香港已經訂立咗2050年嘅減碳嘅目標嚇，即係碳中和嘅目標。咁未來呢半年咧，大家要幫手監察政府咧，就係有冇出到一個嘅合乎呢個目標嘅行動計劃、指南、里程碑、預算案。咁然後係喺每年嗰個推動嗰度咧，係可以向市民咧係交代。咁同時間亦都呼籲咧係企業、民間團體、市民咧係一起咧係認真對待呢個嘅氣候災難啊，因為氣候災難係無疆界嘅，係啦。咁我哋作為一個比較富裕嘅大城市咧，係比其他嘅地方咧有更大嘅責任。係啦，同埋嗰個嘅機遇。咁氣候變化咧，作為一種商機，我今日唔講啦。我哋係民間團體係咪？咁但係其實呢個亦都係個現實。咁所以咧，希望大家咧唔好落後於形勢，係啦。咁我等一陣咧，我哋會播一首歌俾大家聽嘅，即係一個香港嘅青年人作，係啦。即係我哋開始嘅時候歡迎嘅時候已經播過，但係可能好多人咧。未睇，咁希望大家聽埋先走啦嚇。咁我哋會將呢個嘅報告咧係擠上我哋嘅網嘅，咁大家可以係公眾資訊，大家可以隨便係download，係啦，即係去睇。咁有意見咧，亦都可以俾我哋謙虛接受任何嘅批評同埋補充。氣候變化咧唔係任何一個人一個團體可以做得到嘅一件大事。係需要咧，係各方面集思廣益，一齊努力嚇。咁好啦，咁今日嘅時間都過咗好多啦。咁希望大家咧係支持呢個低碳想創坊一個細嘅團體喺我哋嘅 Facebook、LinkedIn 同埋網站裏邊咧係支持我哋留言 like 或 share。咁好多謝大家今日出席呢個活動。亦都好多謝咧，係幫我哋做研究嘅呢個嘅研究員，幫我哋俾分嘅老師，另外咧就係贊助呢個 巴黎協定嘅一啲嘅基金會，因為我哋啲基金會個個都好低調嘅，咁我就唔一講啦，就係即係在心裏邊感恩嚇，多謝佢哋咧係支持呢個咁有意義嘅行動嚇，亦都繼續會係我哋嘅伙伴。好咁希望咧大家咧能夠係努力繼續建立一個低碳嘅社會，令我哋呢一代同埋下一代都有希望。多謝。